Good afternoon and welcome to the National Combined Grand Round on COVID-19 being held by the All Indian Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi. I welcome you again to another grand round in this series of weekly grand rounds that we are having to really update everyone as far as COVID-19 is concerned. We've had a number of topics and discussions, and we are now moving almost into the 10th month of this pandemic. And in these last 10 months, one thing that we've noticed is that there has been an improved survival as far as patients are concerned with COVID-19. And that survival is linked to many factors. Some people feel it's linked to better drugs. But if you go down the pharmaceutical pathway, you'll find that there still exists a lot of controversy as far as most drugs are concerned, whether it be hydroxychloroquine or whether it be remdesivir or tocilizumab. The jury is still out as to how useful these drugs are and whether they have any mortality benefit. The only drug which has actually shown some mortality benefit continues to be steroids itself. Therefore, I think what has really made a difference as far as decreasing the mortality is concerned is best supportive care or better care for these patients. And that is something that has really turned the table in terms of decreasing the mortality. And we are trying to focus on that today. That is, how are we going to really manage patients who have severe COVID-19 and require ICU care, which could be high flow nasal cannula, non-invasive ventilation, or it could go on to mechanical ventilation. What is the care that we can provide so that mortality comes down in these sick patients? Remember, they form a small percentage of the overall number of cases of COVID-19. Majority, 80 to 85%, will have mild illness and recover with just supportive treatment. But what really makes a big difference in decreasing mortality is this small percentage, which accounts for I would say more than 80 to 85% of mortality as far as COVID-19 is concerned. So this is the focus of today's discussion on ventilation in severe COVID-19. And I have an esteemed panel who will take your questions. I have on my left Dr. Anjan Trika, who is Professor of Anesthesia, Pain Medicine and Critical Care. On my right is Dr. Naveed Vig, Professor and Head Department of Medicine. We have two esteemed panelists from outside. We have Dr. Kulkarni, Assistant Professor of Pulmonary Critical Care Medicine from the Washington University School of Medicine, St. Louis, US. And we also have Dr. Saderia, Consultant Critical Care, Wirral University Teaching Hospital, United Kingdom. So I'd like to really welcome our international faculty, and it's a pleasure to have both of you here for our combined round. We will start off first. Thank you. We'll start off first with our case presentation, interesting cases which will try and give you the spectrum of cases that we've seen and how we manage them, right from oxygen therapy to ventilatory support with tracheostomy and the challenges. After that, we will have a case discussion on ventilation in COPD-19 patients. And then we will take your question and answers. I would request you that if you have any questions, please WhatsApp them on the number which is given below. That is 9999692364. I'll repeat that, 9999692364. And we now start the session, and I'll ask Dr. Akhil Kumar Singh to present the first case on severe COVID-19 requiring ventilatory care. Over to you, Dr. Singh.
Thank you, sir. So the first case we are going to discuss is a severe COVID ARDS in a geriatric patient with multiple comorbidities. So this lady was a 94-year-old lady who presented to us with heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, and she was post cardiac resynchronization therapy device implantation in 2016. She underwent two PTCAs 2016 and 19, and she was a known case of hypertension, COPD, and type 2 diabetes mellitus. As you can see, she was on a number of medications to manage her comorbidities. She presented to us with a history of breathlessness for 3 days and had tested COVID positive from an outside lab. On presentation, her vitals were within normal limits except for that she was saturating 90% on a non-breathing mask at 10 liters per minute. She had a GCS of 15/15. Her labs were unremarkable except for a PO2 of 89 on an ABG which was taken on room air. So the PF ratio was quite low for her. As you can see, this was her X-ray on the first day of admission. Multiple bilateral infiltrates with a lower zone predominance. On day one, and as she was admitted to the ICU, she was started on broad-spectrum antibiotics, ivermectin, methylprednisolone, Clexane at a thromboprophylactic dose, vitamin C, zinc, and nebulizations with Duolin and Budecort. Her medications, which she was on previously, were continued. So this graph basically demonstrates her course during her stay in the ICU. On the left-hand corner, you can see that she had an initial PF ratio of around 110. When she came to us, she was put on a non-rebreathing mask for the first day. Did not result in a lot of improvement in her PF ratio. She was gradually, on the second day, shifted to HFNC, high flow nasal cannula, with varying flow rates ranging from 40 liters to 60 liters and varying FiO2s as well. During the course of these maneuvers, she was encouraged to lie prone. Awake proning, as is known, is a common modality which is being increasingly employed in these sort of patients. So the protocol at our institution is to make these patients, encourage them to lie 2 hours prone, then 2 hours in the left lateral position, 2 hours in the right lateral position, and 2 hours in the supine position with a 30-degree head elevation. On day 6, we noticed that she had improved PF ratio, so we gradually shifted her back to NRBM. There was a concomitant hyperglycemia for which insulin infusion was started. This was probably because of her methylprednisolone injections. When she was prone on day 6, one of the residents noticed a sacral bed sore. This was probably pre-existing because it was too soon for someone to develop a bed sore. From days 6 to 11, she had a waxing and waning course. Her PF ratios used to improve. She used to be shifted back to NRBM, then it used to go back down, and she had to be shifted back to HFNC. On day 8, she had a spike of fever. She had leukocytosis, and because of this, the antibiotics were escalated. On day 11, it was noticed that she was not maintaining saturations even at high FiO2s and high flow rates of HFNC. So she was shifted to non-invasive ventilation. Initially, the pressures required were less, but as she progressed in the ICU, her PF ratios went down and her oxygen requirements went up. On day 12, again, she had a spike of fever. She had a TLC of 19,000 and a lactate of 2.9. She was also hypertensive. A diagnosis of sepsis was made and inotropes were started as well, along with escalated antibiotics and added antifungals. On day 13, around 2 to 3 days after initiation of these maneuvers, she responded. Her oxygen requirements went down. She was more comfortable. Fever had subsided. So she was gradually weaned off to NRBM. Debridement for the sacral bed sore was done under local anesthesia in the ICU itself on day 13. With increasing PF ratios, she was doing better. The inotropes were gradually tapered. By day 17, her inotropes and antibiotics were stopped. She was moved to nasal prongs with an oxygen requirement varying between 2 liters to 4 liters per minute. On day 18, she was discharged home with an advice for maintaining domiciliary oxygen therapy. This is a snapshot of her labs. As you can see, day 9 had a TLC of 17,000, which went up to 19,000 on day 12. Lactate was 2.9 on day 12, corresponding to a diagnosis of sepsis. Serial X-rays. You can see a gradual clearing of the lung fields from day 1 through day 18. As mentioned previously, she was advised domiciliary oxygen therapy. She was conscious and oriented and accepted oral feeds. Vitally, she was stable and maintaining a saturation of 92 to 96% at an oxygen supplementation of 2 liters per minute through nasal prongs. So all in all, she went home with oxygen, but the take-home message from this particular case we drew was that elderly COVID patients are not a lost cause. Just because someone is over 90 doesn't mean we give up. With aggressive therapy, with interventions at the right time, we can avoid intubations and actually use other modalities such as HFNC and NIV to avoid intubation and have a better outcome as compared to if you were to intubate these patients. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akhil Kumar Singh. We will now, before we take up any issues as far as these cases are concerned, we will have the presentation. So we will go on to the next part of the presentation, which is severe COVID-19 with comorbidities, which will be presented by Dr. Venkata Ganesh. So Dr. Ganesh, please, with your cases. You can start now.
Good afternoon. The second case will be COVID ARDS in an obese diabetic patient. We have a 52-year-old male who was obese and a known case of diabetes on metformin for the past 7 years. He was hypertensive on telmisartan and amlodipine also for 7 years. His presenting complaints were fever and dry cough for 4 days. He also had difficulty in breathing for 2 days. On examination, he was conscious, oriented, of heavy build, obese with short neck, 98 kg in weight, 170 centimeter height, and a BMI of 34. His baseline vitals were within the normal limits. His respiratory rate was 28 per minute, and there was no use of accessory muscles of breathing. However, his saturation was 75% on room air, which improved to 89% on simple face mask at 6 liters and to 96% on non-rebreathing mask. He was afebrile. There was no pallor, lymphadenopathy, edema, and cyanosis, and the rest of the examination was unremarkable. A provisional diagnosis of severe acute respiratory infection was made, and which was later confirmed COVID-19 by RT-PCR. And since he was a case of severe COVID, he was shifted to the COVID ICU. On day 1, he received non-rebreathing mask at 10 liters per minute as respiratory support. He maintained a saturation of 95%. However, his PF ratio was less than 100. At presentation, in his investigations, his TLC was raised to 14,000, a PO2 of 80 millimeter mercury on non-rebreathing mask, and a urea of 100. The rest of the investigations were within the normal range. This is the chest X-ray on day 1, which shows bilateral fluffy infiltrates. He was started on anti-inflammatory therapy with steroids, prophylactic Clexane, which is low molecular weight heparin. He was also started on prophylactic antibiotics and insulin and amlodipine for his comorbidities. His PF ratio on day 1 was around 80 when he was given a non-rebreathing mask, and since he was obese and uncooperative to be in the prone position, he was made to rest in the lateral position for about 12 hours per day. Simultaneously, he was also started on hydroxychloroquine, methylprednisolone, and low molecular weight heparin. And fluids, we managed by guiding it through IVC measurements via ultrasound. By day 3, his PF ratios worsened, and so he was escalated to HFNC support with lateral positioning, and remdesivir was also started. At this point, hydroxychloroquine was stopped. He had increased respiratory rate by around day 5, for which he was shifted to non-invasive ventilation with lateral positioning. And during this phase, his PF ratios were relatively stable around 80. But he had an episode of sepsis as evidenced by raised TLC, raised CRP, and procalcitonin, for which he was started on meropenem and teicoplanin. He also had hyperglycemia ranging from 320 to 265. There was increase in PCO2 and a decrease in PO2 as well, for which we had to intubate him by around day 9 and put on invasive mechanical ventilation, paralyzed with rocuronium, and prone positioning for 16 hours a day for the first 2 days. He was sedated with fentanyl and midazolam infusions, as well as rocuronium infusion was also continued. He had septic shock by around day 10, as evidenced by again raised TLC, CRP, and we had to give him noradrenaline and colistin based on a blood culture showing Acinetobacter and anidolafungin as an antifungal, as he was also a diabetic. During this phase, his hyperglycemia resolved. His PF ratios also improved, as did his, we continued the steroid therapy, antithrombotics, as well as fluids monitored via invasive arterial pressure. He was extubated by day 14, and his inflammatory markers also resolved, and he was kept on face mask for the next 5 days, during which he had an episode of hypertensive crisis, at which point we had to give him labetalol and prazosin. His PF ratios and hyperglycemia further improved when he was stepped down to the HDU and kept on nasal prongs for the next 2 days. The steroids were tapered and switched off. And for the next 1 week, he was on room air with a further improvement in PF ratio. And later, he was discharged on day 30. Some of the problems we faced while providing respiratory support were that positioning was very difficult as he was obese and uncooperative for awake proning. We had to keep him in lateral position for the initial days when he was on non-rebreathing mask, HFNC and NIV. We required more manpower to prone him when he was intubated and paralyzed. With regard to the ventilatory parameters, he had high peak airway pressures ranging from 40 to 60, which was risking pneumothorax and which required frequent nebulization. There was poor respiratory system compliance, and there was a need of relaxant infusion despite deep sedation because of his obesity. This is a representative figure showing raised peak and plateau pressures during one of the episodes of bronchospasm. This slide shows the progress in terms of X-ray changes. Initially, there were abundant bilateral fluffy infiltrates, which slowly resolved, and when he was kept on NIV, he started developing a patch in the left lower zone, and this is when he was intubated, which shows maximum lung recruited, and post-extubation and on day 9 when the infiltrates have decreased, especially on the right side. This was day 29 when he was discharged. At discharge, he was conscious, oriented on room air with a PF ratio of more than 300 and stable respiratory rate. His PO2 was 73 millimeter mercury on room air. The rest of the investigations were within the normal range. He was advised to continue medication for his comorbidities. He was advised pulmonary rehabilitation exercises, home quarantine for 7 days, and for a follow-up visit in the COVID clinic 15 days after discharge. So the take-home message in this patient would be, in obese patients, even though awake proning is difficult, timely decision to intubate, ventilate, and proning will help in a speedy recovery. In difficult cases such as this, persistent and aggressive management will yield results even without novel forms of therapy, novel forms of ventilation, or even drugs.
Thank you, Dr. Ganesh. We've already started getting some questions regarding these two cases. But before I take those questions, we will have one more case presentation to complete the whole picture. And this is going to be again a patient with severe COVID-19 who required even more intensive ventilatory support. And I'll again ask Dr. Singh to present this case as far as the third case is concerned. And then we'll take a few questions from the cases. Dr. Singh.
Thank you, sir. So the third case we're going to discuss is that of a geriatric patient with severe COVID ARDS with difficult weaning. So this lady was a 60-year-old lady with a known case, who was a known case of diabetes, hypertension, and COPD. She had a past history of a cerebrovascular accident and a chronic history of atrial fibrillation. She had chief complaints of cough and slurring of speech for the last 7 days and shortness of breath for the last 2 days. On admission into our ICU, she was tachypneic and was saturating 84% on room air. She had a GCS of 14/15, along with right facial nerve palsy and right upper limb weakness. On admission, she was started on oxygen by face mask, was given doxycycline, methylprednisolone, Clexane at a thromboprophylactic dose, ivermectin, vitamin C, and zinc. Her labs on the first day were unremarkable except for leukocytosis with predominant neutrophils. Day 1 X-ray. This was on the ABG was on face mask at 6 liters per minute, showed a PO2 of 96. We got a mobile CT head done in the ICU on the first day itself, which did not show any acute changes, but did show a chronic right thalamic infarct. So the day 1 PF ratio was around 160. She was started on broad spectrum antibiotics, methylprednisolone, IV fluids, and thromboprophylactic dose of Clexane. Initially, she was on HFNC, but because of progressive hypoxia, not able to maintain saturations, she was intubated on the 5th day. She was intubated, she was sedated and paralyzed, and she was made to lie prone. Lung protective strategy, ventilation strategies were used, targeting a tidal volume of around 6 ml per kg, PEEP and FiO2 according to the RDS network guidelines, and targeting a P-plat less than 30 centimeters of water. With these strategies, we saw some improvement in the PF ratio, and on day 10, we decided to start weaning her. Now, the weaning was complicated by multiple episodes of severe bronchospasm, which are probably attributable to her pre-existing COPD. But at the end, we were unable to wean her, and we failed to wean her on day 11. Day 11 to day 12. And on day 16, a decision was made to tracheostomize her in the OT. For this, the low molecular weight heparin was stopped 1 day prior, and she was tracheostomized in the OT by our ENT colleagues. Once she was tracheostomized, the LMWH was restarted again, this time at a therapeutic dose because she had concomitant atrial fibrillation as well. So we were worried about her throwing an embolus. While we were able to gradually wean her off oxygen, her ventilatory support requirements went down till about day 21 when she spiked a fever again. Because of the spike in fever and the raised TLCs, we escalated her antibiotics, started on her on inhaled on IV colistin as well. From day 23 onwards, once her fever settled and she was clinically improved, we started weaning her slowly. We gave her multiple trials of spontaneous breathing trial every day. There was active chest physiotherapy involved, and we tried different modalities to loosen her chest secretions, which were a lot. And all of this helped us to gradually wean her till about day 28. This was around 10 days, approximately more than 10 days since a tracheostomy, when we were able to successfully wean her off. She was gradually weaned off the mechanical ventilator, and she was put on a TPs. And gradually, her PF ratios improved enough so that we could put her on room air. She tested RT-PCR negative on day 33. Because of her concomitant neurological issues, it was decided that she needs to be transferred to neurology, which was done on day 38. She was bridged from Clexane to warfarin because of her chronic AF issues, and she was transferred to neurology on day 38. A snapshot of her labs during the stay. So serial X-rays show clearing of her lung issues gradually. As you can see, day 17, when she spiked fever, day 16, day 17, there were increased infiltrates in her lung, which gradually cleared off till day 37, which was the last X-ray. Her room air ABG, final room air ABG in our ICU showed a PO2 of 119. She was transferred to neurology with a tracheostomy in situ and on warfarin. Tracheostomy suctioning was advised, and chest physiotherapy was advised as well. She was asked to follow up in the COVID clinic after 2 weeks and follow up with the ENT OPD after 4 weeks for tracheostomy decannulation. So the final take-home messages from this particular case were that there are no silver bullets when it comes to COVID-19 management. Even if you do not have access to novel therapies like remdesivir or tocilizumab, does not mean that you cannot take care of such patients, that we cannot make them go home safe and sound. Standard ICU care still matters. The things which we've been doing for many, many years still matter, and they will continue to matter. And aggressive management can actually change outcomes for the better in such complicated patients. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we've just tried to give you a snapshot of 3 cases showing how good management, whether it be oxygen therapy, proning them, or managing patients who need ventilatory support or even have weaning issues and need a tracheostomy, can be managed with just good supportive care. The first case actually did not get remdesivir, which at that time was not available in our country. And yet that elderly, more than 90-year-old lady came out and was able to be discharged. This was also shown in the other case, the third case, where again we were not having to really give remdesivir, and we were able to manage with good supportive care. So the message here that we're trying to give is that when you're looking at ventilatory management or managing patients in the ICU, if we follow the good basics that we have been sort of talking of for decades, looking at the ARDS network protocol and other supportive management, we can still make a huge difference as far as saving lives is concerned. There are a few questions which have come up, which I'll ask the treating team. One question which I'm going to ask Dr. Anjan, because this is related to the first case, that we had, that patient was actually on ivermectin, and the second case was on hydroxychloroquine. So one of the physicians asked that, are we giving ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine in all ICU patients?
Okay, we're really not giving it as a protocol for all ICU patients, but when they come at that time, and mind you, we've changed our guidelines over the months. It's a new disease, so at that time, these were cases who came to us in the month of April. At that time, HCQ was being used in all cases who came to us with mild disease also. But in the elderly lady, we didn't give her because of her basic AF, because of her age and her cardiac issues. So we gave her ivermectin. So at the present time, we have a different treatment modality.
And I think it's important to understand this is a disease which evolves. So you may have an individual who is actually presenting to you early as a mild illness, and you may be giving some antiviral drugs like ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, or other drugs which you would give for a mild illness. But if the patient deteriorates and goes into a moderate to severe illness, then your treatment strategy totally changes, where you're looking at steroids, anticoagulants, low molecular weight heparin, and now currently one would also consider giving remdesivir. If you believed in convalescent plasma, you could also consider that. So treatment strategy will depend as the disease changes or progresses. Many patients may just stop with mild disease, and you may not really have to give other drugs. So probably ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine was given because of that. Anjan, just one more question before we go on to the panel discussion. And that was, why were antifungals given in the second case?
Okay, antifungals were given in the second case, though all other antibiotics were as per the culture reports. We had given antifungals because we thought that she reached a score which we normally use to give empirical antifungals. So we thought it was worthwhile. I agree that people could call it as an overkilling of this thing which was not there. We didn't have fungal cultures positive or any test positives, but that was an overuse, and we thought we should do it, especially in that case.
With that, maybe this was something that was sort of an over-treatment. Retrospectively, I would have said that antifungals were not required in that early stage, and there was really no evidence of fungal infection, and we could have got away with just the broad spectrum antibiotics. But sometimes in the ICU, when you're seeing a very sick patient with multiple comorbidities and underlying diabetes, you're always worried about an indolent fungal infection which may be there. So it's basically at times the call of the treating physician whether to start antifungal upfront or wait for some time and do that. So I think at this point in time, considering the multiple comorbidities, obesity, the patient being a diabetic, and then intubated, the team felt that it's better to cover with antifungal rather than have a risk. So that is an individual patient-to-patient based decision. So before I take the other questions, some of the questions are also related to in general, and I'll ask that to the faculty from the UK and the US. But before I do that, we'll have a quick presentation which will be on ventilation in COVID-19 patients. And Dr. Richa Agarwal from the Department of Anesthesia and Critical Care from our trauma center, which is now the COVID-19 center, will make a brief presentation to give you an overview of this topic. And then we'll have this question and answer session. We already have a large number of questions, so I think we'll spend more time on that. So over to Dr. Richa.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be discussing about ventilation and oxygenation in severe COVID. Now, what is severe COVID? Severe COVID in adults is defined as adult with clinical signs of pneumonia, that is fever, cough, dyspnea, plus one of the following: tachypnea, that is respiratory rate of more than 30 breaths per minute, and hypoxemia, that is saturation of less than 90% on room air. Incidence: it is present in almost 15 to 20% of all COVID cases, and out of these 15 to 20%, 5% they become critical and may require invasive ventilation. The risk factors for severe COVID include old age, chronic diseases like cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, and obesity. Patients with severe COVID, they commonly meet the criteria for ARDS, which is now being referred to as CARDS. The incidence of ARDS on the basis of oxygenation criteria is high. It is around 20 to 67% of all the in-hospital COVID patients that develop ARDS, and it is present in 100% of mechanically ventilated patients. It is categorized as mild, moderate, and severe according to the oxygenation, which was given in the Berlin criteria. It has a high mortality, with mortality of more than 50% in patients who are ventilated. Now, what is CARDS? Is it different from the typical ARDS? Initial studies, they suggested that CARDS is a distinct identity because of the following facts. First, the onset time of COVID-related ARDS is around 8 to 12 days, which was inconsistent with the Berlin criteria, which defines 1 week limit. Secondly, some of the patients might have normal lung compliance. Third, COVID pneumonia coexists with ARDS. It is not ARDS alone. And the other thing was that there was diffuse alveolar damage. Along with that, there was pulmonary thrombosis, which was seen as dilated pulmonary vessels on CT scan of these patients. Gattinoni and his co-workers identified 2 phenotypes. They described the 2 phenotypes of COVID ARDS, that is type L and type H. Type L was characterized by low elastance, but high compliance, low ventilation perfusion ratio, low lung weight, and low lung recruitability. They described another type, which is type H, which was characterized by high elastance, high right to left shunt, high lung weight, and high lung recruitability. They even gave different treatment modalities for these two types. However, with the emerging evidence, it is now being recognized that these 2 types do not exist, but these are the continuum of the same disease. These just reflect the natural evolution of ARDS. Gressely and his co-workers, while studying the pathophysiology of COVID-19 related ARDS, they did a prospective observational study, which was multicentric, including 7 hospitals of Italy. They studied the mechanically ventilated patients of COVID-19 who met the Berlin criteria and who were admitted to ICU, and made the conclusion that patients with COVID-19 ARDS, they have similar form of injury as ARDS, which is unrelated to COVID-19. So now we know that it is the similar ARDS, but not different type. What is the management? Is the management same? Surviving Sepsis Campaign, the Society of Critical Care Medicine have given guidelines regarding the management of patients who are hypoxic. How to manage a COVID-19 hypoxia patient? I will concentrate on that. The first thing is to administer oxygen and see what is the need, see if there's any need for endotracheal intubation, which might be impending airway obstruction, increased work of breathing, refractory hypoxemia, hypercapnia or acidemia, or encephalopathy. If these things are there, then please intubate the patient. Do not wait for any improvement in oxygenation. But if these are not there, then we can give a trial of oxygen therapy. If the patient still remains hypoxemic, then we can go on to high flow nasal cannula. And again, if the patient remains hypoxemic, before intubation, we can give a trial of non-invasive ventilation. The same protocol was followed in our patients also, along with awake proning. In the first patient, which was a 93-year-old female, we managed with HFNC and NIV. In second patient, who was an obese patient, invasive ventilation was started after the non-invasive measures failed. And in patient 3, which was a case of CVA, we intubated early due to poor GCS. So at all points, we have to see whether there's any indication for intubation or not. Now, oxygen therapy, when to start? When the saturation is less than 92% by nasal cannula or face mask, and target is to maintain the saturation between 92 to 96% in all except for COPD patients. We don't aim to go higher than 96%. Along with that, start awake proning. Any patient who is requiring oxygen, we start awake proning there and then. How does it help? So now when the patient is in supine position, there are ventral alveoli which are open, but dorsal alveoli, they are collapsed. But they are getting good amount of blood flow. When we prone the patient, these dorsal alveoli open up and there is improvement in the ventilation perfusion ratio, which causes improvement in the oxygenation. However, not all the patients can go for awake proning. We should know when not to do awake proning. The absolute contraindications being patients who are in severe respiratory distress, that is respiratory rate more than 35, do not ask them to prone awake. If there's an immediate need of intubation, if they are hemodynamically unstable or agitated, or they have unstable spine. Relative contraindications being facial injury, neurological issues, morbid obesity, and in pregnant patients. How do we do awake proning? The protocol has already been told by Dr. Akhil that we do 2-hour slot lying in the prone position, then on the right side, then sitting up with the head up, and then on the left side, and then prone again. The aim is that the patient is in the prone position for most of the day, that is at least 12 to 16 hours in a day. The evidence behind that, so a feasibility study was done in the COVID patients in which 56 patients were recruited. Proning was feasible in 83% of the patient. There was substantial improvement in the oxygenation. However, after resupination, oxygenation was maintained in only 50% of the patients. And the patients who responded, they were more likely to respond if the procedure was done early after admission to the hospital. Conclusion, proning is feasible, effective, but the effectiveness remains only in half of the patients. So further studies are warranted to ascertain the potential benefit. Similar results were found in another study in which 24 patients were recruited and only 15 patients could tolerate proning for more than 3 hours and only 3 were persistent responders. So the debate is still on what is the actual effect of awake proning and how can we improve that. Now, if the patient still remains hypoxemic on awake proning, what is the next option? Then we go on to the high flow nasal cannula. But remember, we always require a cooperative patient for high flow nasal cannula. Why high flow nasal cannula? It has already been shown in non-COVID patients that high flow nasal cannula has shown improved survival as compared to non-invasive ventilation or conventional oxygen therapy. This was a study published in NEJM in 2015, which showed improved survival with HFNC. What about in COVID patients? This study was done in COVID patients where it was a retrospective study where the authors compared HFNC versus no HFNC. In COVID patients, there was improvement in the rate of ventilation. The HFNC reduced significantly the rate of intubation and subsequent invasive ventilation, but did not improve case fatality. Now coming to the role of non-invasive ventilation. It may have a role in mild respiratory failure only if HFNC is not readily available. It has no role in severe respiratory failure. However, it can be used as a first therapy in patients who have respiratory insufficiency due to COPD, cardiogenic pulmonary edema, or obstructive sleep apnea. But we should be aware of the side effects and barotrauma caused by NIV. We have had 2 patients who suffered severe barotrauma because of NIV. These patients, they were on NIV for 2 days and they suffered severe subcutaneous emphysema, which resolved later on. But both these patients, they had to be intubated later on and they could not, and they succumbed to the COVID-19. Any studies regarding these, regarding non-invasive ventilation and high flow nasal cannula? Not much data is available, but yes, a small study which compared high flow nasal cannula and NIV in COVID-19 patient is there. It is a small Chinese study recruiting around 40 patients. In this study, they did not find any difference between the 2 groups when these were used as a first-line therapy. However, an important message was there that no medical staff got nosocomial infection during this study. So there's a fear of getting nosocomial infection after HFNC and NIV use, but this was not seen in this study. Now, what if the patient remains hypoxemic even after non-invasive means? What next? Then there is the role of mechanical ventilation, which is personalized lung protective ventilation. Fan and his co-workers published in the Lancet this year that what should be the approach to the COVID-19 related ARDS. It should be a different. They strongly recommended that we should adhere to evidence-based management, which includes lung protective ventilation, individualized positive and expiratory pressure, prone positioning, and ECMO if possible. Now, for the benefit of all the listeners, I would like to say how we manage the initial settings in our ICU. The first thing which needs to be done is to calculate the predicted body weight of the patient, assess the minute ventilation. The first mode needs to be volume assist control mode with a tidal volume of 6 ml per kg predicted body weight with the ventilator rate which matches the baseline minute ventilation. It has to be less than 35 breaths per minute, an initial PEEP of 5 to 10 centimeter depending upon the oxygenation. The target is to keep the PEEP plat less than 30 centimeter, that is to limit the barotrauma, and to keep the driving pressure, which is the difference between the plateau pressure and the PEEP, to less than 14 centimeters of water, and to keep the saturation between 88 to 95%. This P-plat can be easily measured on the ventilators by pressing the inspiratory pause button. However, if we are not able to achieve the P-plat more than less than 30 centimeters, then we have to decrease the tidal volume by 1 ml per kg to 4 ml per kg. And if the P-plat decreases, we can increase the tidal volume. The PEEP settings which we can use this PEEP settings from the ARDS net protocol, and we can also allow some amount of hypercapnia in these patients with a pH goal of 7.3 to 7.45. What to do if the patient still remains hypoxemic even after optimum ventilation? The next steps which we can do is optimization of the PEEP. There are many methods described, but there's no particular method of determining what is the appropriate level of PEEP, and these has to be individualized, seeing the patients with the bedside methods. Other things which we can use is the neuromuscular blockers. The guidelines suggest that we should use only intermittent dosages of neuromuscular blockers, but however, if there's persistent ventilator dyspnea, there is need of ongoing deep sedation, prone ventilation, or persistently high plateau pressures, we can use neuromuscular blockers as a continuous infusion, but only for 48 hours. And the other things which can be tried are prone positioning. Prone positioning has already shown a survival benefit in patients with non-COVID. The prone positioning should be done ideally in 12 to 16 hours a day, and it improves recruitability in COVID patients also, as shown by a single study. As a rescue therapy, we can also use recruitment maneuvers, but in staircase, incremental PEEP should not be is not recommended. We should use the other recruitment maneuvers. And as a last resort, we can go up to veno-venous ECMO. The ELSO guidelines, consensus guidelines, that is the Extra Life Support Organization, they have given guidelines that ECMO should be used only in an experienced center and by the trained team, and not by all. There is some debate also that ECMO may not be effective owing to the cytokine storm and hypercoagulability of COVID-19 in all patients. So we really need to see which patients are in real need of ECMO. Other modes of ventilation which we can try is are given in the literature also is the pressure controlled ventilation. It necessarily prevents barotrauma, but the delivery of tidal volume is variable and it requires intensive monitoring. So it should be used only if we have adequate staff available to monitor the ventilation. And the other fascinating mode which has raised lots of interest during the COVID-19 is APRV mode. It is a bi-level ventilation mode using an inverse IE ratio, allows the patient to breathe spontaneously during any phase of ventilator cycle, maintains alveolar recruitment. However, there are only anecdotal case series and case reports showing benefit, and there is an ongoing clinical trial for this mode in COVID-19 patients. In non-COVID patients, no significant difference has been observed in outcome with different modes. So we would say let's use the mode which you are compliant with, which you can monitor. There is no role of high-frequency ventilation in COVID ARDS. So this is the diagram. This is the showing management of ARDS stepwise approach. We start with a low tidal volume, keep an eye on plateau pressures and PEEP, increase the PEEP to improve the oxygenation, and then we can go up to neuromuscular blockers or prone positioning, and then in a trained center we can discuss the ECMO. Coming to the weaning and extubation, weaning, we follow the similar weaning criteria as in non-COVID patients. There has to be progressive reduction of pressure support and daily spontaneous breathing trials. But during the extubation, we should always remember that most of the patients, they have prolonged intubation around 10 to 14 days. So they develop some kind of translaryngeal edema and may land up in extubation failure. So the approach should be conservative while we are extubating the patient, as premature extubation can expose the patient as well as staff to the risks which are associated with urgent rescue oxygenation strategies and reintubation. Now the last word on tracheostomy. Now, this is the most controversial topic these days: when to tracheostomize, how to tracheostomize, and who should do the tracheostomy. Even in our institute, there have been multiple guidelines till now on this topic, but the most important one are here. The first guidelines that was published in the Lancet, they said that the tracheostomy should be delayed until at least day 10 of ventilation and should be considered only in patients who are showing improvement. It can be either surgical or percutaneous. The ICU team and the surgical team, they should review the optimal location during the pandemic in their institute. However, the ACCP guidelines, they suggest they do not specify any timing when the tracheostomy should be done, but yes, they say that the tracheostomy should be considered in any patient who is expected to require prolonged ventilation. Thank you. The take-home message I wanted to say here that COVID ARDS is similar to ARDS, which is unrelated to COVID. Maintaining oxygenation and ventilation is the most important, with individualized lung protective ventilation being the mainstay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Richa Agarwal. And we will now move on to the questions, and I'll start with the panelists who are abroad I'll ask Dr. Kulkarni one question, which has come from one of our, on the WhatsApp group, which is that this is a doctor who writes that he has a patient who is on HFNC at around 60 liters per minute, but his saturations continues to dip. His saturations are very low. He is conscious, he has a normal respiratory rate. What should he do next? What would you advise him, Dr. Kulkarni?
Yeah, so I think as the physicians have, have presented, I think trying the awake-prone positioning is a very good idea. We have been doing that in our center, and we have had success in quite a few patients. I think the contraindications that were suggested are quite valid. So assuming they don't meet that, it's certainly worth trying that. We have also tried as an alternative to non-invasive positive pressure ventilation, we've tried the oxymizer, which allows higher flows of oxygen. And that has sometimes allowed us to avoid using non-invasive positive pressure ventilation or invasive mechanical ventilation.
We accept a higher peak pressure in obese individuals when we are ventilating them? So this question is for Dr. Sadera. If Dr. Sadera, yeah, can you hear us?
Thank you very much. First of all, thanks for inviting me, and it's great to see all of you again. I would agree that yes, a higher peak pressure would be accepted in a person who's obese. In fact, we've got a lot of experience with this. We've had patients of around 180 to 200 kilos, even one patient of 250 kilos on our unit as well. So for us, higher peak pressures are something which we see on a day-to-day basis. I'm not sure what the peak pressures mentioned were, but we're quite comfortable with 33, 34, 35, 37. So yeah, that's absolutely fine. I absolutely agree with that.
Okay, so I think Anjan, you wanted to say?
And that's perfectly fine. I think, Dr. Sadera, you said something which we have to accept. At times in this part of the country, we of obese patients, now we've started seeing them, and the classic number which was said about the peak pressure and the plateau pressure will have to be changed once you have patients who are above 100 kg or 120 kg or something of that kind. Our patient was about 98 kg, and we had a peak pressure about 40 or 50, 40 something, and we had to accept that. One has to individualize all these patients, and that's why it says individualized ventilation for all these patients.
Thank you very much. We'll one question that is for Dr. Vig here. What is the role of doxycycline? Because we had given doxycycline also. So do you think it has a role as far as COVID-19 is concerned?
So doxycycline is an immunomodulator, plus it is antibiotic. It covers for atypical organisms. So so that's why it is used instead of azithromycin, because it doesn't cause change in QT interval. So it is a safer bet in these patients, if at all, any antibiotic which is to be used for atypical organisms, because azithromycin or quinolones both will cause increase in QT interval, and especially if patient is on hydroxychloroquine, not this severe patient, mild to moderate, then there is a problem.
Thank you. We have another question, which is basically, I can ask this to Dr. Kulkarni. This is regarding a patient that a doctor is saying that how do you give nebulization to a patient who's on NIV and who desaturates on minimal discontinuation or disconnection of the non-invasive ventilation? How do we manage such patients?
Yeah, I guess it depends on the device that you're using, and in some cases we are able to add it to the to the circuit, but it does bring up a concerning issue that if the patient continues to desaturate on non-invasive positive pressure ventilation, then and everything else has failed, then maybe at that point they may need if everything else has been optimized, then at that point they may just need to be on mechanical ventilation.
Because if it's not working and you are really requiring that much of NIV, that even on a mild disconnect, it's causing fall in saturation, you need to be very careful, and rather than having the patient crashing and then having to do an emergency intubation. There's another question which I can ask Dr. Sadera, which is basically, how many days of NIV do you continue? Would you continue before considering intubation? Is there any time limit for continuing non-invasive ventilation before you would consider intubating your patient?
A million-dollar question, and that's something we've learned. So initially, when we had our first phase, we started early intubations when non-invasive was failing, but that didn't go well at all. And in fact, we had situations where 2 out of 3 of our intubated patients were dying. So now what we do is, as you've done in your first case, we continue high flow nasal oxygen, CPAP with CPAP, as long as we can. As long as the patient can tolerate it, as long as the gas exchange remains okay, as long as the patient doesn't go into severe respiratory distress, we just continue it as long as possible. There's no time frame as such.
I agree with that. I think the most important issue is to evaluate the patient, and if the patient is tolerating it, he's not going into respiratory muscle fatigue, he seems to be all right, it's better to continue with non-invasive ventilation rather than intubating the patient, because the complications and the problems that you can have with by intubation are much more. Therefore, there is really no end point as long as the patient is able to tolerate it, and you just have to keep waiting till the primary disease improves and you may get away without having to really intubate the patient. One question that I have for Anjan, which is what is the role of procalcitonin and for starting or stopping antibiotics as was done in our cases?
Procalcitonin, Procal as we call it, is in fashion nowadays, at least in this part of the country, and a lot of times we do it whenever we send investigations. Ideally speaking, Procal is being advised to be used to de-escalate and not to escalate or to initiate antibiotic therapy. So it is one of those things which we regularly use in ICUs to de-escalate our antibiotic therapy, and that's the way it should be practiced. There are so many studies in the literature which are all before the COVID era, where Procal was used for all possible things. However, the consensus remains that it could be a useful marker for de-escalation and nothing else.
Thank you very much. So I think that is really the role. The Procal has always been in debate even before COVID-19 in terms of its utility for diagnosing it. I think the data is more towards de-escalation rather than actually being able to guide you as far as starting antibiotics is concerned. Now, there's one question which I have, which I'll ask Dr. Vig, and maybe if Dr. Kulkarni and Dr. Sadera would like to add to that. And this is basically a question which a lot of people have asked. If remdesivir was given early on day 1, would it have improved the outcome? And should we now move to a strategy of giving remdesivir even in mild cases rather than in moderate cases, as is being now advocated possibly in the US? So I'll start with Dr. Vig, and then I'll ask all the 2 experts from UK and US to give their opinion.
So what I would say that remdesivir should be reserved. It should not be used as soon as possible. it should be only used for patients who require oxygen therapy, and oxygen therapy will not be required on day 1. It will be required most likely on day 6 or day 7 or afterwards. So we should give remdesivir only on patients who are on oxygen, who require oxygen therapy, because we should not use it early. We have other antivirals which can be used, and probably then remdesivir will not be used. I would say using remdesivir early in the disease in mild patients and without oxygen therapy, it is harmful, and because it probably changes with the immune function, and then later on cytokine storm may be little faster. So my message is, don't start without until unless oxygen therapy is required, and then if it is required, then give it for 5 days. And but other important thing, when oxygen therapy is needed, other important things are, you need anti-inflammatories, you need proper dose of steroids, then you need anticoagulation, you need proper doses of anticoagulation, and then the most important is proper oxygenation. We need to oxygenate them properly so that we take care of oxygenation, we get good anti-inflammatories, because by that time virus is already decaying. And those patients who are severe, whose viral load at that time might be higher, their role of remdesivir might be there. If we give it earlier, in later stage when it is required, there will be no drug which will be effective, because we know remdesivir is number 1 drug, number 2 is HCQS, and rest other are number 3, 4, 5. So that is how we think, we conceptualize. Studies will keep on coming, but the issue is we should preserve it only for oxygen therapy, because in them viral load will be slightly higher, but at the same time cytokine storm will also be there. Thank you.
So any comments from Dr. Kulkarni regarding when do you think remdesivir should be given in our COVID-19 patients? It's become a big issue, and there's always a issue of availability also, and let's say patient pressure, if I may put it that way.
Yeah, no, it's I agree with the concerns that have been voiced, and I think one of the panelists said this earlier. I think we are in the science is evolving, but in the absence of currently additional data, I agree with Dr. Vig that remdesivir should be used primarily in critically ill patients or who need oxygen therapy. There is some data. Right now the published data suggests that the length of hospital stay, or the time to clinical improvement may be better. But given the overall shortages, I would agree that I think reserving it for severe COVID is better. When they need oxygen therapy is probably a better approach.
Dr. Sadera, anything else you would like to say?
Yes, we had as well. In our first phase, we didn't have remdesivir with us. We have it now in our second phase. Now, if you go as per the theory, remdesivir should be used only when there's viral replication, which is in the early stage. But I completely agree with Dr. Wig that actually what we're doing now is we are using remdesivir in all the patients who come to our ITU. Let's just say that the consensus is still out. Not all of us agree that it's having any effect. It's sort of very difficult to say, because we're using remdesivir along with dexamethasone as well. So it's a bit difficult to say what's working and what's not working. The other problem is that the disease process and the type of patients we're getting now on the unit are probably different from what we had before. So I'd probably agree with Dr. Wig, yes.
Thank you. So I think we have a little bit of consensus as far as when remdesivir should be used. One question I have is for Dr. Anjan Trikha. Do we increase the dose of steroids when we move from non-invasive ventilation to invasive ventilation? And what is our policy as far as that is concerned?
Okay. We've changed our practices over the last 6 months. We normally have been users of methylprednisolone, and we still use it as a default steroid. We've not at all used dexamethasone, and we really were using a standard dose of about 40 milligram in adults twice a day. However, lately we've changed our policy, and as the patient deteriorates, we try to increase it because we've realized that it's only the steroids which are going to work. So we increase it to about we we've even gone up to 2 milligram per kg body weight per day as far as steroids are concerned. So one could consider increasing it, especially you also see other markers, CCRP, D dimers, and then you could increase it. There is always a case of increasing it as you go along or as the patient gets severer.
Thank you very much. So I think that really covers it all in terms of this point is concerned. We have another question which I'm going to ask Dr. Vig and maybe ask the panelist from abroad, and that is the role of tocilizumab. What is its role? And the question that is, does it reduce stay, and can it actually increase lung fibrosis?
So there are three things. One is convalescent plasma, then is remdesivir, and then is tocilizumab. So what I'm trying to say here is that we should first give good oxygenation. We should, in a severe patient, we should get good oxygenation. We should give remdesivir. We should give full amount of steroids. That is 1 to 2 milligram per kg of methylprednisolone. Once we achieve this, and then we decide that this patient is not responding to treatment and is worsening, there is the role of tocilizumab, and we ensure that there is no bacterial infection. Patient's work of breathing is increasing, and we have no option. Only in that condition we should use it. Otherwise, using it has its own harmful effect. So I would say use it whenever the patient is worsening on optimum dose of steroids, oxygenation, anticoagulation, and even antivirals. Then there is a use, and it is associated with its own harmful effects like infections, like bone marrow suppression, GI perforations. So it has its own side effect, like increasing lung fibrosis. Now this is the question. Will it increase or will it not increase? I don't know. It prevents lung fibrosis also. And whether this increase in fibrosis is because of disease itself or because of anti-IL-6, I don't know, to be honest.
So I just would like to ask the panelists abroad one by one. Dr. Kulkarni, your experience as far as tocilizumab is concerned, and what would you, when would you say it's useful, and do you think it actually decreases or increases lung fibrosis?
Yeah, I am biased. I have been very unimpressed with tocilizumab. And I think there are, as we've all been talking about, in the early phase in March and April, a lot of our patients were being given tocilizumab off-label. And some improved, some did not improve. We ended up with secondary infections in some of our patients, like Dr. Vig mentioned. And I would say over the last 3 months or so, we have completely moved away from using tocilizumab in our ICU. And personally speaking, I don't think our outcomes are any worse. I would potentially say they may be even somewhat better, based on what I think has been discussed in these grand rounds, that good supportive care. So we are doing some clinical trials in our hospital for immunomodulatory agents, and I continue to still believe that outside of steroids, any sort of immunomodulatory therapy should potentially be done as a part of a study, not as empiric, use. And that's the approach we've adopted. So sort of we've really moved away from using tocilizumab and have not seen any downside to moving away from using it.
Data both ways. You have the studies which, the Covacta study and others which actually did not show a benefit. There's other studies which published in the Lancet which did tend to show a mortality benefit. We don't really have a definite data, and I think it's also important to really be very careful about selecting your patients, because as was mentioned, it's a double-edged sword and can lead to a number of complications, including superadded infection, which one does see in patients with fulminant sepsis and fungal infection. So Dr. Sadera, any comments that you would like to give as far as tocilizumab is concerned in the critical care setting?
We haven't used it at all. We haven't used it before. We have in the first phase, we aren't using it now as well. However, our respiratory physicians in the pre-ICU phase, one of the arms of the recovery trial, they've started using it. But in an ITU setting, as I said, we haven't used it. I don't think we've got any plans of using it as well. So yeah, I'd completely agree with Dr. Wake again.
I think this is a very important message that we should give out because of the fact that it's been used a lot in India. And very often people felt that this was like a magic bullet, and there was a huge demand that tocilizumab should be given based on some data which was emerging at that point in time. And I am aware that in certain hospitals in India, it was actually used very early in people even with mild illness, where they didn't have even features of going into a cytokine storm, which can actually be more harmful. So I think there is more and more data emerging that this is not something which is required in most patients. As I said, it may not be required, and what we're hearing from both the UK and the US is that they're not actually using it at all. And therefore, the huge thrust on giving tocilizumab has to be tapered in our country, because I think it's being overused or misused more often than not. I'll now move on to one question which is there, which I'll ask Anjan, that is there a role in the ICU of giving low dose aspirin along with steroids? Do antiplatelet drugs have a role? Because some people feel that they should add aspirin or clopidogrel also along with steroids.
Okay, as a standard protocol, other than steroids, which we know what works for us is heparin in whichever way, unfractionated heparin or low molecular heparin. So these anticoagulants are the mainstay, and along with these, actually there is no role to add a D-plat or an aspirin with these patients. We do get a lot of patients who are on both these drugs because of the cardiac issues, and we try to stop them, and we try to, if we are using unfractionated heparin, we try to monitor our coagulation, or we go into therapeutic or prophylactic use of low molecular weight heparin. Patients who have been stented or have had cardiac interventions, at times they come too early to us with COVID, so we try to shift them to heparin and stop all the rest of things.
I think that makes it clear. I have now a question which is basically to our the panelists from abroad, and that is their experience with ECMO. There have been very few patients that we've actually looked at who've had ECMO, and some of these patients actually have been on ECMO for weeks because if they have extensive lung involvement, it's very difficult to get them off ECMO. So I'm going to ask, I'll start with Dr. Kulkarni, your experience as far as COVID-19 and ECMO is concerned, and how effective do you think it is as a part of a treatment strategy?
Yeah, so we are a referral center for ECMO, in about 3 or 4 states around us. I think the concerns with ECMO are similar to even in non-COVID patients, and maybe worse in some ways. I was talking to Dr. Trika before this conference, and I agree. I mean, thankfully, we are in a position where we have a active lung transplant center. So I think there has to be a way, sort of an exit strategy for ECMO. And we've been carefully selecting patients who to put on ECMO. In some cases, we have put people who would not be ideally candidates for a lung transplant, even if they were COVID negative. And that has not gone well. So I think there was a paper published in Lancet, if I recall, a couple of days ago, where they published the survival rate in patients with ECMO 40%. With heart restricting it based on very strict on the exo criteria. That's been oh.
Some benefit, if I'm not mistaken.
Sorry about the voice break. Yeah, I said our is strict with that.
some time. Dr. Sadera, any update that you would like to give?
Yeah, we have ECMO services, and they're basically cardiothoracic centers. Now, our very first patient, the first patient we intubated, was on a ventilator for quite some time, and very early on we spoke to the ECMO centers. Now, the experience in the UK has been that ECMO really hasn't had good results at all. In fact, the ECMO centers have been very reluctant to take patients for a variety of reasons, because they say that number one, these patients, because of the comorbidities and because of the age of these patients, they weren't good candidates in the first place. Secondly, whenever they put patients on ECMO, they actually, in fact, they haven't had any survivals at all. So as such, ECMO doesn't seem to have much of a role at present, and towards the end of the first phase, we stopped referring patients for ECMO altogether.
Thank you very much. So it's again giving some idea as to what the international experience is as far as ECMO is concerned. There's another question which I think is more related to treatment protocol. This is a question about a patient who has been intubated in the third week of illness. So it's a late onset complication. RT-PCR is negative now. Can the patient be moved to a non-COVID ICU, and what management strategy would you do? So this is something we face every day. So Anjan
This
could
is
answer
something
that.
which we face every day. We've been facing every day, trying to push patients who become COVID negative after RT-PCRs and trying to convince our colleagues all over the hospital, which is a non-COVID area, to shift patients. Ideally speaking, we should be shifting these patients to a non-COVID area. There's no reason this patient should be there in a COVID area anymore. After having said that, I'm sure each one of you would have tough times convincing your neurosurgeons, neurologists, surgeons, medicine internalists, everybody. So everybody of us needs to have a guideline, and I must acknowledge that Professor Guleria has been very supportive to us every day. We have a meeting, COVID meeting practically every day, and every day he supported us, and he emphasizes the fact, and he tries to sensitize everybody that unless we remove patients who are non-COVID from a non-COVID area, we can't get in new patients. So this patient has to be removed to a non-COVID area.
Dr. Vicky, want to something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that we have to understand how much viable this virus is. So in mild patients and moderate patients, the viability of this virus is up to 8 days. So after 8 days, even if RT-PCR, which is not recommended to be done, is done, this viral is not active even if RT-PCR is positive. Now the question comes in severe and critical patients. So in severe patients, the viral viability may be up to 15 days to 20 days maximum. So 15 days is the 95%, it will be inactive. Virus will not be viable. So 3 weeks is in between, maybe after 3 weeks you can shift them. So that's how it is.
Thank you very much. There's one question in terms of, maybe I can ask both Dr. Kulkarni and Dr. Sadera in terms of how and when do you decide to use HFNC and NIV, and is there any advantage of alternating the two in managing these severe patients who have COVID-19 and requiring higher oxygen therapy?
Can you hear me? Okay. Sorry about that disturbance. So far, our approach has been to start them off without non-invasive positive pressure ventilation if we can avoid it. So we start off with HFNC, and then, as I mentioned, the oxidizer early on. And only if they fail that, we go to NIPPV. Although our experience has been, if it gets to that point, very often they are getting worse and they'll need to be put on invasive mechanical ventilation. The biggest advantage, I think, with using not having NIPPV is the patient, if they are stable, they are much more mobile. So for purposes of awake proning, for example, they are able to do it much better if they don't have the face mask covering their face. Other experience has been that the patient can also eat. So if they are stable, and I think Dr. Sadera mentioned earlier that sometimes these patients may need to be on it for many days. but till they start getting better. So it also allows them to eat, and, sort of participate in more activities, which makes it easier for everybody. We have not alternated the two therapies.
Any, Dr. Sadera, any comment from your side?
Yeah, we agree with what Dr. Kulkarni said. The thing is, we would start with the high flow nasal oxygen. But then if things were getting worse, what we do is we shift over to CPAP. And the CPAP we'd use would be hood CPAP, which was a bit more easier for the patients to tolerate. The only thing is, even that can get quite uncomfortable, and especially as far as eating is concerned, as Dr. Kulkarni said. So what we would start doing is that as long as the patient could tolerate the hood CPAP, we'd continue it. And then when they couldn't, then we'd give them a break, and that break would use high flow nasal oxygen as well. And then we try and alternate between the two. As I said, we try to continue this as long as we can, as long as the patient would tolerate things.
Just ask you a question in continuation, then I'll go to Anjan, and that is that what is the usual CPAP pressure setting that you're using, and when would you consider moving from CPAP to invasive ventilation based on the pressure setting? This is another question.
So we'd start at around about 10. That's what we start with, and sort of keep it with that. We probably wouldn't go higher than that. If the patient needs higher than that, patient's deteriorating, we'd probably go to invasive ventilation at that point. But yeah, around about 10, 5 to 10. But usually we'd start with 10.
Anjan, you wanted to say?
Yeah, I think I agree with Dr. Sadera. That's the upper limit of the pressures we would like to keep. Continuing with that CPAP and non-invasive ventilation mask and high flow nasal cannula. At times, like you've seen in one of our patients, at times if you alternate these two things, the compliance becomes slightly better. And yes, obviously, a high flow nasal cannula is much more comfortable for a patient. But there'll be a small group of patients who will do better on a NIV mask, who are using these devices at their own houses for OSAs, who have COPD, who have high CO2 levels. So they are a group of patients who do better with these. But if you alternate between these two, even those skin excoriations because of tight fitting masks are taken care of, and maybe they get ready for the next round of NIV masks.
Thank you very much. So I'll go on to the next question, which is related more to what we are seeing now in many ICUs, and that is a post-COVID sequelae. So how common is that, and do you have any strategy as far as that is concerned, that is lung fibrosis occurring? So maybe we can start with Dr. Vik. Do we see it frequently in our ICU? And then I'll ask Dr. Sadera and Dr. Kulkarni if they have an experience as far as lung fibrosis, and that leads to a long-term management of these patients even after they come out from the ICU.
So most of these patients will recover. They will take longer time, but there will be few patients who will require some long-term oxygen therapy. So that is how it is. But the issue again is ARDS, COVID ARDS versus non-COVID ARDS. It is so it is probably the same. And I would go ahead with one more thing. We have done the minimally invasive tissue sampling. We have done samples of heart, lungs, kidneys, and so other organs like heart, it is fine. There is no myocarditis. Liver is fine. Kidney, there might be some acute tubular necrosis. It's mainly the lung problem. So if patient is not in multi-organ dysfunction, has purely lung problem, so I would say COVID ARDS in any other ARDS might be same, and there might be other post-viral fatigue things which might be there. There might be issues related to ventilation, some muscle weakness, fatigue. They may persist for a longer time as in non-COVID patients. I don't want to make this post-COVID thing a very big thing because it is unnecessary creating a panic. I want to take away this panic, but there are patients even after routine ARDS who will require some oxygen therapy long-term, and then they improve in the similar way. The way any ARDS responds.
So, Dr. Sadera, any experience that you would like to share regarding pulmonary fibrosis that you're seeing in your severe ARDS patients? We know ARDS per se, even before COVID-19, could cause some degree of pulmonary fibrosis. We also know that patients with acute interstitial pneumonia, AIP, also sometimes land up with extensive pulmonary fibrosis. We saw that with H1N1 also in some patients who had extensive lung involvement and had pulmonary fibrosis. But it seems to there seems to be a concern that it's much more common and causing more problem as far as COVID-19 is concerned. So I just wanted to have your comments and your experience on this.
So this is a big issue even in the UK now. And actually, this question has been raised in Parliament about rehabilitation of patients who've had these problems. Long COVID syndrome is something which is being used now, a term which is being used. Personally, our patients, some of our patients who survived, when we saw their CTs and when we saw their X-rays when on discharge, we were quite worried about what would happen to them, maybe 2 or 3 months down the line. To be fair, they have a few symptoms. They obviously haven't gotten back to 100% normality, but it's not as bad as what's being made out. Right. There are some anecdotal sort of events. In fact, there was one person on TV recently who 3 months down the line still couldn't breathe properly. He was still quite dyspneic at rest. But we personally haven't seen that. The patients, even patients, we've had patients on a ventilator for around about a month. They seem to have done reasonably well. So I agree that's something we probably have to worry about. But I'd probably agree with Dr. Wade that it's not something we have to panic about too much.
So I think what we're realizing is that at time of discharge, many of these patients will show a CT scan which will look pretty bad. But over the next 4 to 6 weeks, many of them actually show improvement because these are more of post-viral inflammatory changes rather than actually fibrosis. And with good pulmonary rehabilitation, maybe a little bit of low dose of steroids, majority of them actually tend to come out and they start maintaining good saturation even without oxygen. And I think the focus here has to be on good pulmonary rehab as far as these patients are concerned, and they should be able to come out. But it has actually become a big concern. Maybe it's not that much of a problem as is being made out, but that only time will tell. I think it depends on how these patients evolve over the next 3 to 6 months. But the important message that I would like to give here is because, again, this is something that we're seeing frequently in our country, and I don't think there's enough evidence. Although there is one paper in the Lancet early, I think it was in March or April, of antifibrotic drugs being used in these patients. I think currently we don't have enough evidence to say that they should be used upfront at the time of discharge. You may have some patients who 3 months down the line show extensive fibrosis. There also you could debate because most of the antifibrotic drugs, whether it's pirfenidone or nintedanib, are actually useful to prevent the progression of fibrosis. They don't reverse fibrosis. Most of the post-infective fibrosis doesn't usually progress. It stays on. And therefore, there's no point in giving drugs to prevent the progression of fibrosis because unlike interstitial lung disease, IPF or other diseases which you see with connective tissue disorders, which is a progressive fibrosis, post-infective fibrosis is usually static. It's something that has happened, the damage has happened and the virus has gone away. Currently, we don't have data to suggest that this is a progressive fibrosis. We would need to follow up these patients. Therefore, I don't think currently we have enough evidence to say that antifibrotic drugs should be started. But I am aware that in many centers in India, at the time of discharge, these patients are started on steroids and pirfenidone. I currently feel that we don't have enough evidence as far as this is concerned. We'll move on to another question which I'll ask Dr. Kulkarni, and then I'll ask Anjan also, and that is how are you managing delirium in your non-intubated patients? Because in COVID-19, this is also becoming a big issue because of a lot of stress that these patients face.
Yeah, I think this has come up as a recurring theme in our discussion is that a lot of our management is very similar to non-COVID lung injury. So our approach has been to try to minimize using benzodiazepines where we can to help sort of general behavioral measures of delirium. in some patients, we have used dexmedetomidine in, to sort of help comply with the non-invasive ventilation, though that really has to be very careful, because why is the patient agitated when they are on non-invasive ventilation? Maybe they are struggling, and so they need to then go to the next step. So our practice has been really very similar to non-COVID acute lung injury in the management of these for delirium, purposes of delirium.
As in non-COVID ICUs. And yes, we are comfortable using, and we use a lot of Dexmed, which is a very nice or very useful drug in our ICU settings. We would also like to use quatropine if required, as it becomes a part of a standard recommendations earlier on. But most of the times we get away with Dexmed, and more important is try to avoid drugs which would cause this delirium. After having said that, in spite of doing all this, we see a lot of these kind of issues, delirium in the ICU and some kind of psychiatric or psychological problem in the non-ICU setting in HDUs and wards. And we treat all patients on an individual basis, but in ICU it will be Dexmed and quatropine.
Thank you very much. We have just a few minutes left. Another controversial question which has come in, and I'll ask Dr. Vig and maybe then both the panelists from abroad. And that is, what is the role of convalescent plasma in these sick patients? Would you advocate giving convalescent plasma to those patients who are now requiring high flow oxygen or on mechanical ventilation? Would you suggest?
So you see, it's the timing and it is the patient. So if you pick up the patient at the right time and you give the right thing, then the patient will improve. So convalescent plasma is antiviral. So it has to be given at antiviral stage. And when is that antiviral stage? When a convalescent plasma can be given, the indication remains same as remdesivir. Giving late, no point. So if you have to give early in the disease, at the time when patient starts requiring oxygen therapy, and in spite of your steroids and anticoagulation, patient is worsening, that is the time you give early plasma therapy. Otherwise, giving late, there is no point, there is no use. So it is the timing. For everything, there is a timing. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that is why there's a lot of controversy, because even if you look at various papers, including the paper in JAMA, the convalescent plasma was even given in the second or third week. And then, of course, you have the whole issue of how much is the neutralizing antibodies in them. But I'll ask Dr. Kulkarni for his comments as to what they are doing in their center as far as convalescent plasma is concerned in these sick patients in the ICU.
Yeah, our practice has been to really use it as complementary therapy, and I would agree with Dr. Vig's comments. We've been using remdesivir upfront. The other issue with plasma is that, I mean, it's fancy, but we don't really, you have to be very careful with it. It is a biological product. You have to ensure that it has been gotten from patients who are sick, but there are variations in titers of antibodies. So I think the quality control has to be very high. And in that case, at least in the context of remdesivir, we know exactly what it is doing. So in our practice, we are actually, it's been driven more by the patients and their families who are asking for. But our upfront approach is to start off with remdesivir first and steroids, and use plasma in very selective.
So in our first phase, we weren't giving it at all. In fact, not a single one of our patients. That was essentially because of our. We were running as per the recovery trial, and we weren't. Our center wasn't part of the plasma trial, but even other units in the region and in the country, it's not commonly given. It's just something we're starting to think about now. But as Dr. Wig said, probably in the early stage. But we don't have any experience with it personally, and it's not something we would routinely think of.
Thank you. So again, convalescent plasma has a little bit of a controversy and not being used that much abroad as much as it's being promoted in our country. And again, as Dr. Vig mentioned, that since it's an antiviral, it's you giving antibodies to fight the viral infection, its usefulness is only in the early stage. And you must make sure that it's actually convalescent plasma. It's not just plasma that you're giving. So you must be able to see the antibody titer in the plasma that you're giving. And an interesting study from Erasmus actually showed that if you were to give it later on, then the antibody titers in the patient was as high as the plasma, and therefore it was not of much point giving it later on, because if you did the antibody titers in the patient in whom you were giving the plasma, the titers were equally high, and it would probably not be of much benefit. One final question before two questions actually. One is a quick take, which is a question which has just come in and which I think is related to what has been going on through WhatsApp and certain messages on the role of teicoplanin. So do you think teicoplanin has any role? There is some data which suddenly came out that it has an antiviral role and may be effective. I don't think there's enough evidence to suggest that. Dr. Vig, do you want to add anything?
Again, we have a beautiful national protocol. We should stick to it. We should not go right and left. We have gone enough right and left. We have oxygen therapy, number one. Number two is anti-inflammatory steroids. And number three is anticoagulation. I would put antivirals at number 4 for severe COVID. So don't add anything else. Patient may get for infection, that is a different thing. Let's not complicate things, keep it simple, and that's it. Thank you.
So I would agree with that. I think this is too premature, but there is this question, and there are a lot of WhatsApp messages going around as far as the utility of teicoplanin is concerned for its so-called antiviral effects. So this is one of the questions which has been asked. I'll also like to ask our two panelists from abroad that, as based on the 3 cases that we presented, would you think there was something different that could have been done in terms of the management? We had one patient who was on HFNC and NIV, which was sort of interchanged with as far as the patient was concerned. The other patient was an elderly lady, not intubated, managed, but not given remdesivir. And the third patient who was ventilated and also intubated. So, Dr. Kulkarni, any comments or suggestions to our team in terms of anything else that could have been done?
No, I think the way the cases were handled, given the circumstances and time, I think is good. More recently, we have started doing bronchoscopies in select patients. Again, this is to be center specific because you have to be careful with all the infectious protocols. But in some cases where we are concerned that, especially if it's 2 weeks or 2 or 3 weeks out from the original COVID swab, we are concerned there is a secondary infection. There was this question about antifungal coverage. In that case, sometimes a bronchoscopy can help clarify some of those issues, but it has to be done, with very carefully following infectious protocols. So that's center specific. That was the only other thought I had when I heard those cases.
You, Dr. Sadera, anything else you would like to say that we could have been done as far as these 3 cases that we presented were concerned?
I think they were all managed really, really well, and I think given the comorbidities of the patients, I think it was great that they actually managed to do well. The only thing is, and this is a very minor point, it's in the second patient, the obese patient who had problems with his ventilation. What we do in our center is we very early start them on APRV, but that's something. It's just something we're used to, which is why we do it. But apart from that, yes, absolutely, I agree that everything else is probably the same.
Okay, thank you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask all the panelists to really give their closing remarks and also quick takeaways to our audience as to what they can do to prevent mechanical ventilation, because I think if we can prevent intubating our patients, we can decrease the morbidity and mortality. So I'll start with Dr. Kulkarni. What take-home message would you like to give to the audience, and how would you suggest one could work in preventing mechanical ventilation?
I think I would summarize it well by what Dr. Vig said. That I think stick to the protocols. I think there are many conservative measures we can take, like the awake proning, the different non-invasive modalities we have spoken about. It's always good to follow the principle of do no harm in these settings, and then keep up with the literature, which I think is, centers like AIMS are helping adapting to the protocols. But really using, not being too aggressive upfront unless it's really necessary. And COVID ARDS in many ways is very similar to non-COVID ARDS. So we have to approach it that way in some ways.
Sadera,
Again, I'd like to concur with what Dr. Kulkarni said. I completely agree with Dr. Wade that you stick to a protocol. In this line, I think it's a very sensible national guideline, and people should stick to that. As far as the lessons which we have learned is that try and take all measures. Oxygen, high flow nasal oxygen. Try not to intubate, because once you intubate, then you're in big trouble. So I think that's my take home message from the whole thing.
very much. Anjan?
Yeah, I think we all are on the same page. My take-home message would be that don't give up on a 90-year-old, like we heard all over what happened in the West or other countries. Even the 90th-year-old can go home and have a next birthday. The second issue is, again, each one of us has said it, that go back to the basics and try to do it. And now the third, which is coming up with it, is initially we were afraid, but now we're doing more and more of trekkies. Let's go back to doing our trekkies, getting the patients out.
Thank you.
Test early and treat early, and then patient will not get sick, will not even require oxygen. If require oxygen, oxygenation, steroids, and prophylactic anticoagulation is the mainstay of treatment. We should not be, and remdesivir, tocilizumab, and convalescent plasma is on case-to-case basis. And tocilizumab is only after we have used steroids and in specific indications. So important is to test and then treat, and don't panic, and communicate well with both patients' families, and healthcare workers should also take care of themselves, because it's a panic, and let us try everything to reduce the panic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think what we've really, the take-home messages both from the cases, and I'd really like to congratulate both the presenters for the cases and for the case discussion, have highlighted that if you have a proper management strategy, you can actually decrease mortality no matter what be the comorbidities or the age of the patient. And therefore, the take-home message that we would like to give is follow your standard protocol, follow what you were doing even in the non-COVID time in terms of critical care management. Try your best to avoid intubating the patient as much as possible. Use high-flow nasal cannula, non-invasive ventilation, aggressively work on conscious proning. Many of these things will work, and you will be able to get out without having to intubate. This, I think, is something which we need to keep in mind. Also, drugs are not the magic bullet. As we've discussed, many of these drugs are still controversial. Many centers are not using it and still having a very low mortality. So don't go with this impression that because you are not using tocilizumab or you're not using remdesivir, you will have a high mortality. Good care is all that is required, as you would have done for your patients in the non-COVID era. As far as drugs are concerned, as we've been discussing, timing is crucial. You must know when, what would work, and when, if giving it would actually be counterproductive. So I think that is very, very important in terms of following protocols, having an SOP in place so that your ICU management is done properly, and you know what strategy you must be able to implement. It has to be a team effort, and therefore the entire ICU team has to work as one in managing patients. Putting obese patients in the prone position itself is a big task, and therefore there is a team which is required. And as Dr. Vig mentioned, we also need to protect the healthcare workers. So thank you very much to everyone, but I'll start off by really thanking our international faculty that has come for this panel. Dr. Sadera, thank you very much, and it's indeed a pleasure to have you. And Dr. Kulkarni, thank you very much. I know it's rather early at the US, so you had to get up early. Thank you very much for taking time out, and really delighted to have you. And my own team here, Dr. Anjan and Dr. Vig, thank you very much. And all the other the faculty and residents from the department, Dr. Richa, Dr. Ganesh, and Dr. Akhil, thank you very much, and excellent case. And we'll see you next time, next week, with another discussion with cases and some sort of topic. So thank you very much for listening to this National Combined Grand Round, which is hosted by the All Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi, and also by Niti Aayog. Thank you very much.